The woman standing beside the bakery window had once watched me promise forever to her daughter, and years later, when she turned and recognized me, the paper bag slipped from her hands and burst open across the sidewalk. Apples rolled beneath parked cars, a loaf of bread landed in the gutter, and for several frozen seconds, neither of us moved. Then her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered words I never expected to hear from my ex-wife's mother: "I still think about you sometimes." Before I tell you what happened next, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, because sometimes the people we lose leave behind truths that take years to understand. Her name was Meredith Caldwell, and the last time I had seen her, she had been standing in the courthouse hallway beside my former wife, her face stiff with disappointment while our marriage ended behind a closed wooden door. Back then, I was 32, angry at everyone, and convinced that signing the divorce papers would finally free me from the pain. Meredith had not yelled at me or blamed me. She had simply looked into my eyes and said she hoped I would someday become the man she had once believed I could be. Those words followed me longer than the marriage did. Now, nearly 9 years later, she looked smaller beneath the bright afternoon sun, her silver hair shorter, her shoulders slightly bent, but her expression carried the same quiet strength. I hurried to gather her groceries before traffic crushed them. She knelt to help, but her hands trembled, and when our fingers touched around a bruised apple, something unspoken passed between us: grief, memory, and the strange ache of recognizing someone who had once been family. That I offered to replace the ruined groceries, but Meredith shook her head and tried to smile. She said she had only come into town for a medical appointment and had stopped at the bakery because the smell reminded her of Saturdays long ago. I knew exactly which Saturdays she meant. When I was married to her daughter, Camille, we used to visit Meredith's house every weekend. She baked cinnamon bread while Camille worked in the garden, and I repaired whatever had broken during the week. Those afternoons had felt ordinary then, almost boring. I had not understood that ordinary happiness was the kind people spent the rest of their lives trying to recover. Meredith glanced toward a cafe across the street and asked whether I had a few minutes. Every instinct told me to say no. My life had finally become quiet, and quiet had taken years to build. Yet there was a loneliness in her face that reminded me of my own mother, who had died before I learned how to apologize properly. I carried the surviving groceries across the street and followed Meredith inside. The cafe was filled with sunlight and the soft noise of lunch conversations. We chose a table near the front window, where the afternoon moved in reflections across the glass. For a while, Meredith asked harmless questions. She wanted to know where I lived, whether I still designed furniture, and whether I had remarried. I told her I owned a small workshop outside town and made custom tables, cabinets, and rocking chairs. I admitted I had never remarried. There had been relationships, but none had lasted. Meredith lowered her eyes and stirred her tea, although she had added nothing to it. Then she said Camille had never remarried either. The news struck me harder than I expected. I had imagined my ex-wife living somewhere far away with a husband who understood her better than I had, perhaps raising children in a house filled with photographs. That imagined life had helped me forgive myself. Learning that she had remained alone opened a door inside me that I had nailed shut years ago. Meredith did not tell me where Camille lived or what she was doing. Instead, she asked whether I remembered the final year of our marriage clearly. I said I remembered enough: the arguments about money, my long hours at the workshop, Camille's growing silence, and the morning she told me she could no longer live beside a man who was physically present but emotionally gone. I had believed she was ungrateful. I had accused her of abandoning me when I was working so hard to provide for us. Meredith listened without interrupting. Then she quietly said there were things Camille had never told me. A month before our separation, Meredith had been diagnosed with breast cancer. Camille had driven her to appointments in secret because Meredith had begged her not to worry me while my business was collapsing. At the same time, Camille had discovered she was pregnant. She had planned to tell me after the first doctor's visit, but she miscarried 2 days before my largest client declared bankruptcy. When I came home that afternoon, she had been sitting alone in the bathroom, bleeding and frightened, while I took a phone call in the driveway and then left again without noticing her red eyes. The cafe seemed to tilt around me. I remembered that day. I remembered rushing inside to change my shirt, complaining about money, and telling Camille I could not deal with another problem. She had stood in the hallway with one hand pressed against the wall and asked whether I could stay home for just an hour. I had kissed her forehead without looking at her and said I had people depending on me. For years, I had treated that moment as proof that she did not understand the pressure I was under. Now I saw it for what it had been, a woman asking her husband not to leave her alone during the worst hour of her life. Meredith's voice broke as she explained that Camille had never wanted the miscarriage used as a weapon against me. She believed telling me after the divorce would only create guilt, not healing. Meredith had respected her daughter's wishes, but the secret had grown heavier with every passing year that I stood abruptly and walked outside, unable to breathe in the crowded cafe. Sunlight reflected sharply from windshields. People passed carrying shopping bags, laughing, checking their phones, living ordinary afternoons while the foundation of my past cracked open beneath me. Meredith followed slowly and found me gripping the metal railing near the curb. I asked why she had told me now. She answered that she had received another diagnosis that morning. The cancer had returned, and although her doctors were hopeful about treatment, she was tired of carrying unfinished truths. She said she thought about me sometimes because I had not always been the angry, absent man I became at the end of the marriage. I had once sat beside her husband during his final illness, repaired her leaking roof without accepting payment, and built a cedar chest for Camille from wood salvaged from her grandfather's barn. Meredith remembered the young man who had loved her daughter, and she had spent years wondering whether that man had survived beneath the shame. Her words did not comfort me. They broke me. I told her that after the divorce, I had blamed Camille for everything. I spoke badly about her to friends, ignored her final letter, and returned every box of belongings without opening it. I had been so determined to be the injured one that I refused to consider what she might have endured. Meredith reached into her handbag and removed a worn envelope. My name was written across the front in Camille's handwriting. It was the letter I had refused to read. Meredith had found it years later among papers Camille had left at her house. She had carried it in her bag for months, unsure whether she would ever see me. I stared at the envelope but could not take it. The paper seemed more dangerous than any accusation. Meredith placed it gently on the railing and said the choice was mine. Then she began walking toward the medical center, leaving the groceries behind that I watched her go for half a block before shame pushed me into motion. I gathered the bags and caught up with her at the next intersection. I told her she should not attend the appointment alone. She insisted she was used to managing by herself, but I recognized the same false strength Camille had once worn. I asked whether anyone knew about the diagnosis. Meredith admitted she had not yet told her daughter. Camille was leading an art program for children at a community center in a nearby town, and Meredith did not want to interrupt the final week of classes. I said nothing, but I walked beside her to the hospital and remained in the waiting room through the appointment. For nearly 2 hours, sunlight moved across the polished floor while I held the unopened letter in my hands. I could have read it, but I felt I had already failed one woman by leaving when she needed me. This time, I stayed. When Meredith returned, her face was pale but composed. The doctors believed the cancer was treatable, though the months ahead would be difficult. I drove her home in my truck because she felt too weak to take the bus. Her house appeared smaller than I remembered, but the porch still leaned slightly to the left, and the brass wind chime I had given her years ago still hung beside the door. Inside, the walls were crowded with family photographs. Most of the pictures of me had been removed, but one remained on a bookshelf, Camille and me standing in Meredith's garden on our wedding morning, both laughing before life became complicated. Meredith saw me looking at it and explained that she could never throw it away because it captured her daughter's happiest expression. I asked whether Camille knew she still kept the photograph. Meredith smiled sadly and said Camille had been the one who returned it after moving apartments. That I finally opened the letter at the kitchen table while Meredith rested in the living room. Camille had written it soon after our divorce. She did not accuse me of causing the miscarriage, nor did she ask me to come back. She wrote that she had loved me even when love became painful, and that she understood I had been terrified of failing. She said my fear had turned me into someone who treated tenderness as a distraction and vulnerability as a demand. She apologized for hiding her mother's illness and the pregnancy, admitting that silence had become her own form of dishonesty. Near the end, she wrote that she hoped one day we would both stop deciding which of us had suffered more. She wanted us to remember that we had been two frightened people who failed each other, not enemies. The final line said that if I ever built another cedar chest, I should leave one corner imperfect, because perfection had cost us too much. That I wept at that table with my face in my hands. Meredith did not rush to comfort me. She allowed the grief to do what it should have done years earlier. When I could finally speak, I asked whether Camille hated me. Meredith said no, but forgiveness was not the same as wanting the past restored. Camille had built a meaningful life. She taught children who had lost parents, survived poverty, or struggled to speak about their pain. She used art to help them express what adults often ignored. Meredith warned me not to seek her out merely to relieve my guilt. An apology offered for the wrong reason could become another burden placed on the wounded person. I understood. For the first time, I was not thinking about what I wanted Camille to give me. I was thinking about what she deserved to receive. Over the next several weeks, I drove Meredith to treatment appointments during the day. I repaired her porch steps, stocked her refrigerator, and sat with her through the exhausted afternoons after chemotherapy. At first, she resisted every kindness, afraid I was punishing myself. I told her that guilt had brought me back, but care was teaching me to stay. Slowly, our conversations changed. She told me stories about her childhood, her late husband, and Camille's stubborn determination to rescue every injured animal she found. I admitted how lonely I had become and how often I used work to avoid facing myself. Meredith never excused my failures, but she also refused to let them become my entire identity. She said remorse mattered only when it changed the way a person treated people in the present. Camille learned about her mother's illness sooner than Meredith intended. One bright afternoon, she arrived unexpectedly while I was replacing a broken kitchen cabinet hinge. I heard the front door open, then silence. When I turned, she stood in the doorway holding a canvas bag filled with art supplies. Her hair was shorter, and there were faint lines around her eyes, but she was unmistakably the woman I had once promised to love. Shock hardened her expression when she saw me kneeling beside her mother's cabinet. Meredith tried to explain, but Camille asked her to rest, then motioned for me to step outside. We stood in the garden beneath full daylight, surrounded by flowers she had planted years earlier. I told her everything in the simplest words I could manage. I said I had learned about the miscarriage. I had read her letter. I was sorry not because I expected forgiveness, friendship, or another chance, but because she had once asked me to stay, and I had made her feel as if her pain was an inconvenience. Camille's eyes filled, but she did not look away. She said she had waited years to hear those words and had imagined they would make everything feel lighter. Instead, they made her mourn the people we might have become if we had spoken honestly sooner. She admitted she had also failed me. She had hidden too much, expecting me to recognize pain she refused to name. Yet she made it clear that my absence had wounded her deeply, and some wounds did not disappear simply because the person who caused them had changed. I told her I understood. Then I offered to leave and never return if my presence made caring for Meredith harder. Camille glanced through the window at her mother sleeping in the chair. Her expression softened. She said Meredith looked less afraid than she had in weeks. She asked me to continue helping, but only if we kept the past from controlling every conversation. That agreement became the beginning of something none of us expected. Not reconciliation in the romantic sense, and not a return to what had been lost, but a gentler relationship built from truth. Camille and I coordinated appointments, prepared meals, and sat on opposite sides of Meredith's living room during the long treatment afternoons. At first, our exchanges were careful and formal. Over time, we began sharing small memories without collapsing beneath them. Camille visited my workshop and saw the unfinished cedar chest I had been building for Meredith. One corner was visibly uneven. She ran her fingers over it and smiled through tears. I told her I had finally learned that love did not require flawless people, it required present ones. Months later, on a clear autumn afternoon, Meredith completed her final round of treatment. The doctors found no sign that the cancer had spread, and her prognosis was far better than we had feared. We celebrated in her garden with sandwiches, warm bread from the same bakery where we had met, and a small group of children from Camille's art program. The cedar chest rested beneath the porch window, filled with photographs, letters, and drawings. Meredith asked us to sit beside her and confessed that when she told me she still thought about me sometimes, she had not meant romantic longing. She meant she still remembered the son-in-law who once made her feel safe after her husband died. She had missed the version of our family that existed before pride and silence destroyed it. But now, she said, she understood that families did not always return in their original form. Sometimes they were rebuilt into something humbler, with fewer expectations and more honesty. Camille and I never remarried each other. Our story did not need that ending to be meaningful. She later found love with a patient school counselor named Everett, and when she told me, the old version of myself might have felt replaced. Instead, I felt grateful that she had found someone who listened when she spoke softly. I became a trusted friend to both of them, and years later, I built a crib for their first child. Camille cried when she saw it, and I cried too, not because the child was mine, but because life had allowed me to turn regret into something useful. Meredith remained part of my life, and every spring we returned to the bakery where our second chance had begun, not a second chance at the marriage, but a second chance to become better people. Before this story ends, leave a meaningful comment about someone you may need to forgive, apologize to, or simply listen to before more time passes. Do you believe people can truly change when they stop defending their mistakes and begin repairing the harm they caused? Your words may give another person the courage to face a painful truth. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. The deepest lesson I carried from Meredith's whispered confession was that love does not always ask us to reclaim what we lost. Sometimes it asks us to honor it, learn from it, and become kinder because it once existed. I had spent years believing forgiveness would erase my failures, but forgiveness did something far more powerful. It taught me how to live differently. And on every bright afternoon when the wind moved through Meredith's old brass chime, I remembered that broken families do not always become whole again in the way we imagine. Sometimes they become something new, imperfect, honest, and strong enough to hold hope.